I'm truly overwhelmed by the love and support from each of you watching today. You're not just viewers, you're the heart of this channel, and every like, share, and subscribe lights up this journey. From all corners of America and the rest of the world, your kindness and belief inspire me to keep telling these stories. You too can still make your impact count. It's never too late to step that great step. Please join our family by subscribing and sharing. We're stronger together, and I'm so grateful to have you here. Now, let's start with today's powerful story. Haunted Hearts, a terrifying night that sparked unforgettable acts of love and kindness. Rain poured down in sheets as Grace Harper stood at the streetcar shelter on St. Charles Avenue, her burgundy jacket soaked through. Her breath came out in quick clouds as the temperature plunged. For others were trapped there with her, Calvin Rivers clutching his saxophone case, Mrs. Dorothy Patterson trembling in her church hat, and a young couple, Lily and James Chen, holding on to each other tightly. Across the street, pale figures began to drift from the gates of Lafayette Cemetery No. 1. Their forms shimmered like light through fog. Grace's heart pounded as one of them, a woman in a soaked 1920s dress, lifted her arm and pointed down the street toward the Mississippi River, her face full of desperate urgency. No one spoke. The rain hammered the pavement. They could run, pretend it wasn't real, or follow the dead into the storm. They didn't know that this choice would lead them to save a life, and discover that kindness can reach even beyond the grave. What would you do if the dead were trying to tell you something? Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's story. Your support keeps these powerful tales alive. Grace Harper had dreamed of this trip for years. That morning, she'd stepped off the train at Union Station with her small camera bag and a wide smile, feeling the soft hum of New Orleans all around her. It was her first time traveling alone. 28, shy, and cautious, she'd spent 2 years saving every spare dollar from her Vermont teaching job for this week in the city she'd always imagined as colorful and alive. She wanted to walk where jazz was born, to see the iron balconies she'd only viewed in magazines, to taste powdered sugar from Café du Monde. By noon, Grace had been wandering through the Garden District, snapping photos of grand mansions along Magazine Street. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and coffee. Tourists passed her, some laughing, some posing under dripping trees. It was peaceful, comforting, even healing in a way she hadn't expected. She'd promised herself that this trip would mark a new beginning, a step toward courage and self-discovery. But just before evening, the skies changed. The first raindrops came without warning, sharp and cold. Within minutes, the air grew thick and heavy. The storm didn't roll in gradually like most summer showers. It fell like a curtain, darkening everything in seconds. Wind tore through the oaks, bending branches and scattering leaves. Grace ran toward the nearest shelter she could find, a covered streetcar stop on St. Charles Avenue. Her jeans clung to her legs, and water dripped from her hood as she caught her breath. The storm raged harder, rain slashing sideways. She wasn't alone for long. A man hurried across the street and ducked under the shelter beside her. He was tall and lean, his hands gripping a black saxophone case like it held something sacred. His hair was cropped close, his jacket soaked. When he noticed Grace watching him, he gave a polite nod. "Calvin Rivers," he said between breaths. "Didn't think I'd get caught without an umbrella in my own city." "You're local?" Grace asked, trying to smile through her shivering. "Born and raised. Play jazz down at Preservation Hall. Or I used to, until they closed for repairs last week." His voice had a calm rhythm, one that cut through the thunder for just a second. A few moments later, an elderly woman shuffled toward them. She wore her Sunday best, a lavender dress and hat that drooped with rain. Grace quickly helped her up the steps of the shelter. "Thank you, dear," the woman said softly. "Dorothy Patterson. I thought I could make it to the corner before the rain caught me." Guess I was wrong. Her accent carried a lifetime in New Orleans, steady and kind. Despite her trembling hands, she stood tall, as though storms were nothing new. The next arrivals came running hand in hand, a young couple in travel clothes, breathless and dripping. The man pulled his wife close as they stepped inside. "Sorry," he said, brushing water from his face. "We were trying to get back to our hotel before this started." "I'm Lily," the woman added, her voice soft but full of nerves. "And this is James. Honeymooners from San Francisco." Dorothy smiled faintly. "Welcome to New Orleans, baby. She sure knows how to make an impression." They all chuckled awkwardly. The sound of thunder rolled through the avenue, shaking the shelter. For a moment, conversation drifted toward small talk. Calvin spoke about his favorite jazz nights, Lily mentioned the French Quarter, and Grace shyly shared that she taught third grade back in Vermont. But Dorothy's face had grown serious. She looked out toward the street, where the rain hit so hard it bounced off the pavement. "This isn't normal," she murmured. James frowned. "You mean the weather?" "I mean how fast it came. How the air feels. This city's seen storms, but something's off." The others fell quiet. Grace felt it too, the sudden chill that didn't match the season, the unnatural drop in temperature. Her fingertips were numb. Calvin rubbed his hands together, glancing at the power lines. "Street lights shouldn't be flickering this soon," he said, nodding toward the glowing lamps along St. Charles Avenue. One by one, the lights began to blink, fading from steady gold to weak pulses. Grace turned her camera toward the cemetery across the street, Lafayette Cemetery No. 1. The heavy gate stood partly open, and in the flashes of lightning, she thought she saw something move between the rows of tombs. "Did anyone see that?" she asked quietly. James looked, squinting. "Probably the wind. Trees, maybe." "No," Calvin said slowly, stepping closer to the glass. His expression changed, the playful calm gone. "That's not the wind." Another flash of lightning illuminated the cemetery, bright as daylight for half a second. Grace gasped. There, between the old marble crypts, something pale shifted again. Dorothy made the sign of the cross. "Lord help us." The lights above them flickered twice more, then steadied for a moment. The wind howled down the avenue, carrying faint sounds that didn't belong to any storm, low, mournful hums that seemed almost like music, or voices lost in the rain. Calvin stared into the darkness, his hand still on his saxophone case. "You'll feel that," he said softly. "Something's calling." No one answered. They just stood there, 5 strangers bound by the same growing unease, watching the night outside twist into something unexplainable. Grace's heart thudded against her ribs. The cemetery was still now, silent except for the storm, but they all knew what they'd seen. Calvin's eyes stayed fixed on the graves. His voice came low and certain. "There's movement in there. Someone, or something, is coming this way." The next flash of lightning came so bright that everyone flinched. For that brief instant, the shadows of the cemetery vanished, replaced by outlines that could only be described as human, though not alive. Figures stood among the tombs. Dozens of them. When the darkness returned, they seemed to fade, like reflections caught in fog. But the next bolt of light revealed them again, clearer this time. Grace's breath hitched. They weren't illusions. They were people from another time. The nearest figure was a young man in a tattered Civil War uniform, his face pale, eyes hollow but strangely pleading. Behind him, an older woman in a long skirt and bonnet clutched something invisible to her chest, rocking as though soothing a child who was no longer there. A man in suspenders and a white shirt stood with his head bowed, hands trembling. Each flash showed more of them, different ages, different decades, every soul locked in silent distress. "Oh my God," Lily whispered, gripping James's arm. Tell me you're seeing that. I see it, James said, his voice cracking. Maybe it's a projection? Some kind of Halloween thing. It's November, Calvin said quietly, not looking away. Ain't no show tonight. The street light nearest to them buzzed loudly, then blinked out. One by one, the rest followed down St. Charles Avenue, like a row of candles being snuffed by an unseen hand. Within seconds, the avenue was swallowed in darkness except for the lightning that sliced the sky every few moments. The faint glimmer from the cemetery became the only constant glow, a pale shimmer rising from the graves themselves. Grace stepped closer to the glass wall of the shelter, camera still hanging around her neck. She didn't lift it. Her hands were shaking too badly. Her instinct told her to run, to escape whatever this was, but her body wouldn't move. Maybe there's a floodlight in there, she said weakly, trying to find reason in madness. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. No light I know moves like that, dear. The apparitions grew more visible with each lightning flash. Their forms flickered, sometimes solid enough to cast faint shadows, sometimes thin as smoke. Their faces shared one expression, anguish mixed with urgency. Grace's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed that they should flee, but something about the way the figures moved held her still. They weren't advancing to attack. They were reaching out. James, we need to go, Lily pleaded, her voice trembling. We should just run until we find people, cars, anything. James hesitated, torn between reason and fear. There's nowhere to run. You can't even see the street. Calvin stepped forward, eyes narrowed as he studied the cemetery. Listen, he said softly. Do you all hear that? They strained their ears. Between the gusts of wind and the pounding rain came faint notes, a long, sorrowful hum that rose and fell like the beginning of a melody. It wasn't thunder, not the groan of branches or the rattle of the rails. It was closer to music. Calvin pressed his hand over his saxophone case. They're not random. They're communicating. Mrs. Patterson turned toward him, her face pale but composed. You might be right. Another flash of lightning tore across the sky, and this time one of the apparitions stood apart from the rest. She was clearer than the others, a woman in a soaked cream-colored dress with a beaded headband, the kind worn in the 1920s. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her arm stretched forward, finger pointing down the street, toward the Mississippi River. She didn't move her lips, yet her expression said everything: desperation, warning, insistence. Grace whispered, "Why is she pointing?" "She's showing us something," Calvin murmured. Mrs. Patterson's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "They're not trying to harm us. They're trying to tell us something." Everyone turned to her. "I've seen faces like that before," she continued. "In hospitals. When someone's between this life and the next. Sometimes, right before they go, they try to tell you something urgent. Something unfinished." She took a slow, steadying breath. New Orleans is a city with many layers. Life and death walk close here. Always have. The old ones say that on nights like this, when the air turns wrong and the storm moves fast, the line between worlds thins. Lily shivered, her hands gripping James's tightly. "Are you saying they're spirits?" Mrs. Patterson didn't answer immediately. She looked back toward the cemetery. "I'm saying they found us for a reason." The figures began moving again. Their movements grew quicker, their light flickering faster as if time itself was running out. The 1920s woman's gestures became frantic, pointing again and again toward the river, her face twisting with urgency. Calvin watched her closely, his musician's instinct tuning into a rhythm beyond words. "It's like they're caught in a song they can't finish," he said quietly. And they need us to hear the last note. Another crash of thunder shook the ground. The ghosts drew nearer, drifting toward the streetcar tracks. Grace felt a pulse of cold air sweep through the shelter, cutting through her soaked clothes. James took a step back. No. No, we can't stay here. This isn't safe. Lily caught his sleeve, eyes wide. James, wait. What if she's right? What if they are trying to tell us something? Tell us what? He snapped. They're dead. Exactly, Calvin said softly. And yet we can see them. Mrs. Patterson took one careful step forward, her voice calm despite the chaos. When the dying reach out, it's because something unfinished still binds them here. Maybe someone still needs help. Her gaze fixed on the woman in white. She's pointing to the river, but not at it. Something near it, maybe. Grace followed the ghost's line of sight through the storm, though the rain made it impossible to see far. Whatever it is, she said, voice trembling, she won't stop until we follow. The ghost's light brightened suddenly, filling the street with an unnatural glow. For the first time, Grace could see the woman's face clearly, young, beautiful, and filled with heartbreak. Her mouth opened in a silent cry, and Grace felt tears sting her eyes without knowing why. Mrs. Patterson placed a gentle hand on Grace's arm. "Child," she whispered, "I think they're showing us where we're needed." The storm roared, the streetlights died completely, and the five of them stood together, caught between reason and something greater than fear. Calvin's hand tightened on his saxophone case. His expression hardened into quiet resolve. "If they've got a message," he said, stepping toward the rain, "somebody needs to listen." For several seconds, no one moved. The storm raged around them, hammering against the shelter roof, but the silence inside was heavier than the thunder. The glowing woman in the 1920s dress still pointed toward the river, her light flickering like a heartbeat fading in and out. Calvin turned to the others, rain streaming down his face. "We can stay here and hope this ends," he said, "or we can find out what they're trying to show us." James gave a harsh laugh. "You can't be serious. We don't even know what they are." Grace's hands trembled, but something inside her shifted. Every sensible part of her said to stay put, wait for the storm to pass, but her heart, the same heart that had guided countless frightened children through storms of their own, told her otherwise. "I'm going," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "If someone needs help, we can't just stand here." Calvin nodded. "Then I'm not letting you walk alone." Mrs. Patterson's wrinkled hand reached for Grace's arm, firm and reassuring. "You've got more courage than most, child. I'll come too. I've seen plenty of storms in my day, and none stopped me yet." Lily and James exchanged glances. She gripped his hand tightly. "We stay together," she said softly. "If we run now, we'll regret it." James sighed, looking at the dark cemetery once more. "All right. Together." The decision was made. They stepped out into the storm. The cold rain hit like 1,000 needles. Grace's jacket clung to her body as wind whipped her hair across her face. The street glistened under flashes of lightning, and every footstep splashed in shallow puddles. Ahead of them, the ghosts began to move. Slowly, they crossed from the cemetery gates and drifted down St. Charles Avenue, their dim light forming a wavering path through the darkness. The 1920s woman led them, her gestures urgent but graceful, like someone keeping time with music only she could hear. The small group followed. They passed grand mansions along First Street, white columns, iron balconies, gardens half flooded from the rain. Normally, Grace would have stopped to take pictures. Now she barely noticed the beauty. The air smelled of wet earth and river water. The street lamps were out, and the only light came from the glowing figures ahead. As they neared Commander's Palace, the blue awnings whipped violently in the wind. The restaurant's windows were dark, the building eerily silent. Grace looked through one as they passed. It was strange to see a place known for laughter and jazz completely lifeless. Mrs. Patterson's steps slowed as the rain deepened into a cold sheet. Calvin offered his arm, steadying her over a fallen branch. "You good?" He asked. She nodded, giving him a small smile. "Don't you worry about me. Keep your eyes on them." James and Lily followed close behind, their fingers laced so tightly their knuckles were white. Lily's hair clung to her cheeks, and her lips trembled from the cold, but she didn't complain. Every few minutes, she glanced back at Grace, as if confirming they were all still real, still there. The ghosts ahead never stopped. They moved like a slow, silent procession through the garden district, their faint light reflecting off the puddles that filled the uneven sidewalks. Grace's mind raced with questions. Were they walking to their deaths? Was this madness? Yet the thought of turning back felt impossible, like ignoring a cry for help she could somehow hear without sound. At one point, a gust of wind nearly knocked Lily off balance. James caught her quickly, wrapping his arms around her. "We're okay," he murmured, though his own voice trembled. They reached Magazine Street. The shops were shuttered, cafe chairs stacked behind fogged glass, neon signs dark. A gust rattled a metal gate, echoing down the empty road. The city that had felt so alive that morning now seemed ghostly in its own right. Grace tried to imagine anyone else out there at that moment. Police, neighbors, tourists, but there was no one. Just the storm, the five of them, and the spectral glow moving steadily ahead. As they left the main avenue, the streets narrowed, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. Street lights here had been dead for years, their posts rusted and leaning. The houses looked forgotten, paint peeling, windows boarded, yards overgrown. The woman in white slowed near a narrow alleyway, her hand once again gesturing toward something unseen. The rest of the spirits circled around her, their movements growing sharper, more urgent. Calvin paused. "They're leading us off the main street." Mrs. Patterson squinted through the rain. "Where to?" A bolt of lightning answered for them. In its flash, they saw a large, crumbling building at the end of the block, its roof sagging, door half hanging on its hinges. The walls were stained with age, the sign above long faded. "That place looks abandoned," James said. The ghosts floated closer, gathering near its entrance. Their glow brightened until the rain around them shimmered silver. They didn't cross the threshold. They surrounded it instead, flickering rapidly, almost panicking. "They're upset," Grace said quietly. "Like something's wrong in there." Calvin stepped forward, shielding his eyes from the wind. "Whatever it is, they want us to see it." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried through the rain. "We've come this far. We owe it to them, and whoever might be inside, to look." The others nodded, though every heartbeat felt like a drum of warning. They advanced carefully, shoes sinking into the muddy path, wind howling against their backs. When they reached the doorway, the ghost's light grew blinding. For the first time, Grace felt warmth radiate from them, not cold or fear, but something close to urgency and hope. Lily squinted through the glow, blinking water from her eyes. "Wait," she said suddenly. "Look, inside." They turned toward the building. Through a cracked window, faint and trembling, a small light flickered. Not lightning, something steady, warm. Calvin's eyes widened. "Someone's in there." The woman in white turned toward them one last time, her face soft but insistent. She lifted her hand as if to plead, "Now." Grace felt her pulse surge. "We have to go in." Calvin moved toward the door, pushing against the jammed frame as thunder shook the street. The ghosts closed in around the structure, their glow rising to a near-blinding intensity. Somewhere inside that broken building, a human life was waiting, alone, cold, and in danger. Calvin threw his shoulder against the swollen wooden door. It groaned but refused to move. James joined him, the two men bracing themselves as wind and rain whipped at their backs. Together they pushed harder until the old hinges gave way with a loud crack, the sound swallowed instantly by the storm. The air inside was damp and cold, thick with the smell of mold and dust. Grace followed close behind, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Broken furniture lay scattered across the warped floorboards, rusted chairs, a splintered desk, a few forgotten blankets. The walls were streaked with moisture, and every sound echoed sharply, as if the building itself were exhaling after years of silence. "Stay close," Calvin warned, stepping carefully over debris. "Watch your footing." Mrs. Patterson entered last, gripping Lily's arm for balance. "Lord," she whispered, "this place has been left to rot." A faint sound carried from the far corner, a small, uneven breath. Grace swung her light toward it and froze. In the dim beam, a tiny figure crouched under a tattered blanket. Two wide eyes reflected the light back like glass marbles. "It's a child," Grace said softly. She rushed forward, kneeling beside the boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, thin, trembling, his jeans soaked, his hands blue from the cold. His face was streaked with dirt, and his lips were pale. When he saw them, he flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. "It's okay," Grace whispered gently. "We're not here to hurt you." Mrs. Patterson hurried over, her voice steady and warm. "Sweetheart, my name's Dorothy. I'm a nurse. Let me have a look at you, all right?" The boy didn't speak, just nodded slightly. Mrs. Patterson checked his forehead, his pulse, his breathing. "Cold, but not hypothermic," she said. "We need to get him warm." Lily shrugged off her jacket and wrapped it around him. Calvin crouched nearby, pulling a dry rag from his case to help wipe the rain from the boy's face. Grace kept her hand on his shoulder, whispering small reassurances the way she did for frightened students back home. After a few moments, the boy's breathing steadied. He looked from one face to another, eyes wide with confusion. "What's your name, honey?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Timothy," he whispered. "Hi, Timothy," Grace said softly. "Can you tell us why you're here?" The boy hesitated. I ran away." His voice cracked, and he looked down. "My foster parents. They yell a lot. Sometimes they don't feed me much. I wanted to find my real mom. But when it started raining, I came here to hide. The door slammed shut, and I couldn't get it open." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. She squeezed his shoulder gently. "You must have been terrified." Timothy nodded, tears mixing with the dirt on his cheeks. "It was so dark. I thought I was gonna die here." Calvin looked toward the doorway, where the rain still roared outside. "You're safe now, kid. We're gonna get you out." The boy sniffled, then added quietly, "The glowing people showed up." The group exchanged startled looks. "What glowing people?" Lily asked softly. Timothy looked toward the cracked window. "They came when I started crying. I thought they were ghosts, so I hid. But they didn't come inside. They just kept pointing at the door, like they wanted someone to find me." Grace felt the hairs rise on her neck. She turned toward the window. Through the broken glass, faint light shimmered in the storm, the spirits still waiting outside. Their forms no longer thrashed with urgency. Instead, they hovered calmly, almost expectantly. Mrs. Patterson stood slowly, her expression shifting from fear to awe. "They brought us here," she said quietly. "All this time, they were guiding us to him." Calvin looked out too, his voice low. They knew he was trapped. The woman in the 1920s dress stood at the front of the spectral group, her hands clasped together. For the first time, her face looked peaceful. Mrs. Patterson's eyes softened. "I know this building," she said, scanning the ruined walls. "It used to be the Garden District Community Home, back in the 1950s. My mama volunteered here after hurricanes. It was a place for families who'd lost everything." Grace turned toward her. "You think these spirits were connected to it?" Mrs. Patterson nodded. "They were the ones who cared for the living. Maybe when the shelter closed, their work didn't stop. Maybe they've been watching, waiting for someone else to help." Outside, the spirit's light pulsed gently, like lanterns in the fog. Lily whispered, "They're still doing what they did in life, helping people." Grace felt tears well in her eyes. She looked back at Timothy, now bundled in Lily's jacket, his breathing slow and steady. "They saved him," she said softly. "They saved his life." As she spoke, the glow outside began to change. The harsh white light softened to gold, spreading across the rain-soaked street. The ghosts began to fade, their forms turning translucent once more, but their faces were calm now, their anguish gone. Calvin placed his hand against the window pane, as if to thank them. "Rest easy," he murmured. "We'll take it from here." Mrs. Patterson wiped her glasses and turned back to the boy. "We'll get someone to come for you, sweetheart. You're not alone anymore." Grace knelt beside Timothy again, brushing his hair gently from his forehead. "You did so well, Tim. You were brave. Those people out there wanted you to live, and so do we." He looked up at her, eyes shining. "They're gone now," he whispered. Grace glanced toward the window. The last trace of light faded into the storm, leaving only the faint glow of her flashlight. "They can rest now," she said softly. "They did what they came to do." Calvin found an old blanket and laid it over Timothy, while James searched for anything to block the drafts coming through the door. The group gathered close, sharing what warmth they could. For the first time that night, the fear lifted. The wind still howled outside, but inside, there was a quiet sense of peace. 5 strangers and a lost child bound together by something they couldn't explain, yet somehow understood completely. Mrs. Patterson leaned against the wall, exhausted but smiling faintly. "Kindness doesn't always come from the living," she said. "But it always finds its way to those who need it." Grace held Timothy's small hand, feeling it grow warmer in hers. They would wait out the storm together until help came, but in her heart, she knew they had already witnessed something extraordinary, a reminder that compassion never truly dies. Outside, the rain began to ease. The night that began with fear had turned into something far greater, an act of love that crossed the line between worlds. James crouched by the broken window, shielding his phone from the rain that still trickled through the cracks. The screen glowed faintly, its battery icon flashing red. "I've got 1 bar left," he said, voice tense. "If I lose the signal, someone else try." Grace nodded. "Call now. Don't wait." He pressed the emergency number. Static crackled through the speaker, then a voice answered, a dispatcher asking for their location. James gave the nearest cross street, his words hurried and clear. "There's a child trapped in an old community home on Magazine, near 3rd. We've got him out, but he's freezing. Please hurry." The line cut before the dispatcher could respond. James stared at the blank screen, the battery dead. "They got enough," he said quietly. "They'll come." The group gathered near Timothy, forming a loose circle to keep him warm. The ghost still hovered near the walls, faint and soft as mist, no longer agitated but calm, like sentinels waiting for dawn. Their light made the shadows gentle instead of frightening. Lily rummaged through her bag and pulled out a pack of granola bars. "They're a little crushed, But still good, she said, offering one to Timothy. His small hands trembled as he took it, nibbling cautiously before hunger took over. Mrs. Patterson draped her own jacket over his shoulders, shivering in her thin blouse but refusing to take it back. "Keep it on, sugar. I've lived through colder nights," she said with a soft smile. Calvin reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small harmonica. "Mind if I play?" he asked. No one objected. He lifted it to his lips and began to play, a slow, soothing melody that filled the room with warmth words couldn't offer. The notes carried a quiet strength, each one echoing off the cracked plaster like a promise that they weren't alone. Timothy leaned against Grace, half asleep, his head resting on her arm. Grace began talking softly, her voice tender. "In my classroom back in Vermont, I tell stories when my students get scared during storms," she said. "Want to hear one?" Timothy nodded sleepily. She told him about a lost puppy who found its way home by following the sound of laughter. Her words painted comfort into the air, and for the first time that night, Timothy laughed, a small sound, fragile but real. Calvin smiled at her across the dim room, the reflection of his harmonica glinting faintly in the ghost light. "You've got a teacher's magic," he said quietly. Grace shrugged, a shy smile forming. Sometimes stories heal more than lectures ever could. As the minutes passed, something shifted. The fear that had once bound them was replaced by something steady and human. They began to talk, first quietly, then freely. Mrs. Patterson sat close to the boy, rubbing his hands gently between hers. "I used to have a daughter," she said, her voice tender but full of memory. "She passed away when she was 22. Car accident." She took a slow breath. "For a long time, I thought my purpose went with her. But I realized helping others, that's what keeps her alive through me." Grace touched her arm gently. "You've saved more lives than you know tonight." Mrs. Patterson smiled faintly. "The hardest moments of our lives can become doorways to our greatest capacity for love," she said. Her words lingered in the air, like truth carried on the wind. Timothy, wrapped in 2 jackets now, whispered, "I wish you were my grandma." Mrs. Patterson laughed softly. "Maybe I can be, in my own way." Lily, sitting close to James, squeezed his hand. The two hadn't spoken much since the argument they'd had earlier that evening before the storm hit. Now, their silence was no longer distant. It was gentle, shared. "You didn't hesitate to come in here," she whispered. "You always protect people first." James looked at her, his eyes tired but soft. "Tonight showed me something. I don't want to just protect you. I want to build something stronger with you. Together." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Maybe we already started." Calvin played a few more quiet bars, then stopped. He and Grace talked quietly near the window, their voices low but easy. "You always carry music with you?" she asked. "Always," he replied. "Music reminds me that even pain has a rhythm. You just have to listen long enough to find it." Grace nodded. "That's how I feel about teaching. Even kids who seem lost, they've just got a song they haven't learned how to play yet." Their eyes met for a long moment, unspoken understanding passing between them. Two people from different worlds, finding common ground in kindness and shared belief that people, given a chance, can heal. As the hours stretched on, the tension melted into connection. They shared stories about their lives, Grace's quiet life in Vermont, Calvin's nights performing jazz on Frenchman Street, Lily's photography work, James's long shifts as a mechanic, Mrs. Patterson's decades in nursing. Each story was another thread binding them closer. Timothy, once shivering and silent, began asking small questions. "What's your favorite song? Do you think the glowing people are angels? Will they be okay now?" Grace smiled. "I think they already are." The storm outside began to ease, its roar softening to a steady drizzle. Faint light crept in through the cracks in the boards, blending with the ghost's glow. The spirit stood quietly near the entrance now, as if keeping watch until help arrived. Mrs. Patterson glanced at the window. "They're waiting to make sure he's safe," she murmured. "They won't leave until morning." Calvin nodded. Guardians of the living. No one spoke after that for a while. They sat in shared silence, listening to the rhythm of rain, the faint hum of the harmonica, and Timothy's steady breathing. When dawn began to break, its first gold light cut through the storm clouds. It touched the faces of the group, catching the edges of their tired smiles. The spirits shimmered one last time, faint as breath, their light thinning in the brightness of the new day. Outside, distant sirens began to wail, growing closer. Grace looked toward the sound, her voice soft. "Help's coming." Calvin placed the harmonica in his pocket and stood. "We did it," he said quietly. "All of us." The ghosts began to fade completely, their outlines merging with the light of morning. What had started as terror ended as a quiet miracle, the kind born not from fear, but from compassion. Grace looked down at Timothy, still asleep against her arm. "He's going to be okay," she whispered. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "So are we." As the sunlight reached through the cracks and filled the room, the night of fear gave way to a dawn of kindness, the kind that changes people forever. The sirens grew louder until the red and blue flashes painted the wet walls of the ruined building. A police cruiser pulled up first, followed by an ambulance and a white van marked Child Protective Services. The storm had eased completely now, leaving behind a silvery mist rising from the street. Grace blinked in the brightness after the long night. She felt drained, yet deeply calm. The spirits that had surrounded them were fading with the dawn, their glow dissolving into soft streaks of light. One by one, they seemed to bow their heads and vanish, as if their work was finally complete. Paramedics hurried in, guided by James waving from the doorway. "Over here," he shouted. "The boy's safe, but cold." Within seconds, Timothy was surrounded by care, warm blankets, gentle hands, and reassuring voices. A young female paramedic checked his pulse, shining a flashlight into his eyes. "He's freezing, but stable," she said. "You did the right thing keeping him warm." Timothy clung to Mrs. Patterson's hand even as the paramedics worked. She bent low beside him. "You're safe now, sweetheart. No more dark nights alone." He looked up at her with tired eyes. "You'll stay?" She smiled softly. "As long as you need me to." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, lighting up the neighborhood that had looked so menacing hours earlier. Now it was peaceful again, streets glistening, air fresh, and the scent of wet earth filling the silence. A woman in a dark coat approached them. Her name badge read K. Harris, Child Welfare Specialist. Her expression was professional, but her eyes softened when she saw Timothy bundled in the ambulance. "You found him here?" she asked. Grace nodded. "He was trapped inside when the storm hit. We saw something that led us here." The woman frowned lightly. "Something." Calvin stepped forward. "I know it sounds strange, but it wasn't chance. There were lights, figures. They led us to this exact spot." There was a quiet pause before Ms. Harris spoke again. "Well," she said carefully, "whatever led you here, it saved a life. Exposure could have killed him overnight, or this building could have collapsed under the rain." She looked back at Timothy. "He's very lucky. But more than that, you showed him that people can be good, that he matters." Those words landed softly among the group, sinking in like sunlight after rain. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. For the first time, she realized just how extraordinary the night had been. The police officers took brief statements, noting the details with calm respect. There was no disbelief, no ridicule, just quiet acknowledgement that something powerful had taken place. When the questioning was done, Ms. Harris knelt beside Timothy. "We'll make sure you're safe from now on," she promised. "No more bad nights, okay?" Timothy hesitated. "Can I see her again?" he asked, pointing toward Mrs. Patterson. "Of course," Ms. Harris said warmly. "She can visit as often as she wants." Mrs. Patterson straightened her shoulders. "I'll do more than visit. I'll make sure this boy gets what he deserves, a real chance at life." Ms. Harris smiled at her. "We need more people like you." The group stood together outside the building, watching the paramedics close the ambulance doors. The wind was still cool but gentle now, carrying the faint hum of traffic starting up across the city. Grace glanced down at the cracked stone near the doorway. Words carved long ago into its surface caught her eye. "In service to others, we find our purpose." She read it aloud quietly, and everyone turned to look. The phrase seemed to carry the entire night's meaning. Calvin let out a low breath. Seems those ghosts knew exactly what they were doing. Mrs. Patterson nodded. They weren't lost souls, they were guiding ones. Lily slipped her arm through James's. "Maybe kindness doesn't end with death. Maybe it just changes form." For a long moment, no one spoke. They just stood in the early sunlight, united by the strange chain of events that had drawn them together. Strangers no longer. As the emergency vehicles began to pull away, Grace turned to Calvin. "You think they'll really look into his foster situation?" Ms. Harris overheard. "Yes," she said firmly. "An investigation will begin today. We'll find a trauma-informed home that understands what he's been through." Grace nodded slowly, her heart swelling with relief. She glanced at Timothy's small face in the ambulance window. He waved, hesitant, but hopeful. Mrs. Patterson waved back, her eyes shining. When the vehicles disappeared down the road, silence fell again. The kind of silence that follows after something sacred. Lily was the first to break it. "I don't want to lose touch," she said. "This night, it feels like it changed me." James agreed. "Let's keep in contact. We'll regret it if we don't." Grace smiled. "I'd like that." She pulled a notebook from her pocket and tore a page in 5, handing everyone her contact details. Phones were dead, so paper and pen felt almost poetic in their simplicity. Calvin scribbled his number too, handing it to her with a small grin. "Maybe before you leave town, we could grab a cup of coffee? There's a spot near Frenchman Street, best bayonets in the city." Grace met his gaze, warmth spreading through her chest. "I'd like that," she said softly. Lily smiled knowingly. "Looks like New Orleans has more magic left for you than you thought." Mrs. Patterson chuckled, clutching her purse. "You're all coming to my house Sunday after church. No excuses. I'm making gumbo, and we're going to talk about this miracle properly." Grace laughed. "I'll be there." Calvin tipped his hat playfully. "Wouldn't miss it." The sun rose higher, washing the garden district in golden light. The once dark building behind them now seemed less broken, its worn bricks glowing faintly. Grace took one last look at it before walking away with the others. The group parted ways at the street corner, each heading toward taxis, hotels, or home, but something invisible connected them still. They had shared terror, courage, and compassion all within a single night. It wasn't the kind of bond time could easily fade. Grace lingered a moment longer, watching the light spread across the city. Her flight home was in 3 days, but she no longer felt certain she wanted to leave. Something deep inside her told her New Orleans wasn't finished with her story. As Calvin turned back briefly, their eyes met again. "You'll call me?" he asked. She smiled. You'll hear from me before sunset. Mrs. Patterson called from the sidewalk, "Don't let her forget." They all laughed. In that laughter, carried by the morning breeze, the heaviness of the night lifted. The spirits had faded, but what they left behind, kindness, connection, courage, remained. The haunted hearts of the night had become human ones again, alive with purpose. Grace never did catch her original flight. What began as a spontaneous decision to stay a few more days stretched into an entire week, a week that felt both peaceful and alive. The nightmares that had haunted her for months after her divorce were replaced by something gentler, something luminous. She and Calvin met every day. They wandered through the French Quarter beneath swaying iron balconies, where the air smelled of powdered sugar and brass music. At Café du Monde, they sat side by side with steaming cups of chicory coffee, dusting their fingers with bayonet sugar and laughing about how surreal everything still felt. "Do you ever think about that night?" Grace asked one morning, watching the early crowd blur by. Calvin smiled softly. "Every time I touch the keys." He had been playing again, more than ever. At Preservation Hall, he'd introduced a new composition titled Haunted Hearts. The first few notes rose from his piano like ghosts finding peace, and by the end of the performance, the audience was on its feet. The song carried the spirit of that night, the fear, the faith, and the grace of strangers saving a lost boy. Word spread quickly through the local music scene. Haunted Hearts became a sensation, not because of its melody alone, but because of the story behind it. The proceeds from Calvin's shows went to raise awareness and funds for Louisiana foster children. For Timothy, he always said from the stage, Grace never missed a performance. Watching him pour his soul into every note made her realize she'd been searching for more than just recovery. She'd been searching for meaning. By the end of that week, she knew she couldn't go back to her old life in Michigan. "I want to stay," she confessed to Calvin one evening as they walked along the Mississippi River, the sunset painting the water in gold and violet. "Not just because of you. Because this place, what happened here, it woke something in me." Calvin took her hand. "Then stay. New Orleans could use more people like you." It wasn't an impulsive romance. It was something rooted in mutual healing, a slow and steady light that grew brighter with every shared sunrise. Within months, Grace had secured a teaching position at a charter school serving at-risk youth. The first day she stepped into her classroom, she recognized the look in some of her students' eyes: mistrust, exhaustion, that quiet plea for someone to believe in them. She remembered Timothy. And she found courage. Every lesson became a small act of redemption. Every child she reached was a ripple from that stormy night, a continuation of the promise that kindness can rewrite destiny. Lily and James, too, turned that night into purpose. Lily's haunting photographs, taken the morning after the rescue, the sun glinting off the cracked bricks, became part of a campaign to support homeless and displaced youth. Together, they launched New Beginnings, a project that used art to tell stories of survival and hope. The campaign raised thousands in its first year, helping to open shelters and mentorship programs. Every month, Lily and James volunteered together at a youth drop-in center, serving meals and listening to stories. Their love had deepened into something wider, love not just for each other, but for humanity itself. "Kindness," James said once, "is the only ghost worth chasing." And then there was Mrs. Patterson. After decades of retirement and solitude, she found herself back where she belonged, among children. She became a foster grandparent volunteer, visiting group homes to read stories, offer snacks, and remind forgotten kids that they were loved. The workers called her Mama P. The children adored her, especially the shy ones. One evening, after a long day of volunteering, she sat on her porch with a cup of tea and whispered into the twilight, "Thank you, spirits. You reminded me my story wasn't finished." As for Timothy, his journey became a quiet miracle of its own. He was placed with a kind couple in Lafayette, a nurse and a carpenter who'd longed to adopt. The first months were hard, nightmares, trust issues, silence, but little by little, he healed. Therapy helped. So did music. Calvin sent him a small keyboard with a handwritten note. "Play your feelings, little man. They'll tell you who you are." By the time Timothy turned 16, he was speaking at local schools, telling his story not as a tragedy but as a testimony. "People helped me when I didn't believe anyone would," he told classrooms full of restless kids. "And I learned that help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The story didn't end there. It rippled outward, finding its way into lives far beyond New Orleans. Every year, on October 28th, they all came back together. The tradition began small. Grace, Calvin, Lily, James, and Mrs. Patterson meeting at Café du Monde for coffee and powdered sugar laughter. Then they'd walk through the Garden District to the place where it all began. Only now, the building was no longer abandoned. Through Calvin's fundraising concerts, Lily and James's campaign, and a grant Grace helped write, the old structure had been completely renovated into a youth center called the Heart House. Its cornerstone remained untouched, the inscription still visible: "In service to others, we find our purpose." Every October, they gathered in front of it, joined by new volunteers, families, and kids whose lives had been changed. Inside, the halls echoed with music, laughter, and the steady rhythm of second chances. During one anniversary, Grace stood in the doorway, watching Timothy, now grown, confident, teaching a group of children how to play a simple tune on the piano. The melody sounded familiar. "Haunted Hearts." Calvin slipped his arm around her shoulders. "He's playing it better than I ever did," he said with a grin. Grace leaned her head against him. That's what happens when the next generation takes over the song. Mrs. Patterson's laughter drifted from across the room where she was helping a young girl tie her shoelaces. Lily snapped a photo just then, sunlight streaming through the window, dust motes floating like ghosts made of gold. Later, they'd hang that photo in the Heart House's lobby, framed beneath a brass plate that read, "In memory of a night that changed everything, and everyone." Each year, as they shared stories of how that one night still shaped their choices, Grace felt a deeper understanding settle in her heart. The spirits they once feared hadn't just saved a boy. They'd awakened something eternal in each of them. They'd learned that the smallest act of compassion can echo through time, that love, like music or light, travels far beyond its source. And as the evening sun bathed the youth center in gold, Grace realized that the haunting hadn't been about ghosts at all. It had always been about hearts finding their way home. The storm of that night had long passed, but its echo remained in every life it touched. When Grace looked back, she often thought about how it all began, with fear. Real, bone-deep fear. A freezing wind, shadows moving through the fog, the kind of fear that makes every instinct scream to run. But they hadn't run. Somehow, in that terrifying moment, compassion had been stronger than survival. That choice, to follow instead of flee, changed everything. Courage, Grace realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act from love even while afraid. The spirits hadn't appeared to test them. They'd appeared to remind them that bravery and kindness are sometimes the same thing. What had seemed like a haunting turned out to be a lesson about humanity itself. Those luminous figures, trapped between worlds, had shown that goodness can outlive death. Their purpose had been so powerful that it transcended time, drawing 5 strangers together to finish what they started long ago, helping those in need. It was proof that kindness doesn't fade. It echoes forward, touching lives we might never meet. Grace often told her students that story, not the supernatural parts, but the truth beneath it. She told them about the night she learned that fear and compassion can exist in the same heartbeat. About how small actions matter, a granola bar shared with a frightened boy, an old woman giving away her jacket without hesitation, strangers deciding to trust each other in the middle of chaos. Those moments were the foundation for everything that followed. Love, she learned, takes many forms. It isn't just romance or family. It's the quiet decision to care. It's a musician braving the rain to follow a ghost's plea. It's a retired nurse refusing to ignore the cold child in front of her. It's two young lovers holding hands and staying when running would have been easier. That night proved that love isn't limited by circumstance. It's built through choices, small, trembling, selfless choices. Timothy, who once believed he was completely alone, came to understand that he never truly was. Even in his darkest hours, someone, had been watching over him. Call it fate, or faith, or the lingering kindness of those who once served others. The message was the same: community exists, even when we can't see it. When the five of them had found each other that night, they weren't just rescuing a child, they were building a lifelong network of care. Over the years, that connection became their anchor. They celebrated holidays together, supported each other through grief, and reminded one another of what courage really looks like. Mrs. Patterson often said it best: fear and love aren't enemies. They walk side by side. The only difference is which one we let lead. That truth lived in all of them. Grace had gone from a shy, uncertain teacher to a confident advocate for children. Every time she fought for one of her students, she felt the same strength she'd found that stormy night in New Orleans. Calvin's music became more than art. It became a movement. His performances raised thousands for foster programs and shelters across Louisiana. People came not only to hear his songs, but to feel the warmth and humanity behind them. He always introduced his peace-haunted hearts by saying, "This one's about listening when the world tells you to run." Lily and James built their marriage on shared values, turning love into action. Their photography and outreach projects changed lives, offering opportunities for youth who had once lived on the streets. They never forgot what brought them together: fear, faith, and a choice to care. Mrs. Patterson, well into her late 80s, became a living symbol of purpose. "I thought my best days were behind me," she said once during a community interview, "but that night showed me I still had work to do." Her presence comforted dozens of children who needed someone's grandmother to believe in them. And Timothy, his transformation was perhaps the greatest legacy of all. From a scared, abandoned boy to a young man who taught others about hope, his life was proof that love doesn't just save, it rebuilds. Whenever he spoke at schools, he told his audience, "People cared for me before I could trust it." And that changed everything. Each of them carried the same understanding. Fear had been the doorway, but kindness was the key that unlocked their future. The lesson was simple, but it carried weight. The scariest moments in life often hold the greatest potential for transformation. When tested, we find out not just who we are, but who we're meant to become. Grace sometimes stood outside the Hart House, the youth center that grew from their story, and listened to the laughter spilling out through the open windows. Inside, children played, learned, and dreamed, unaware of the ghosts that once guided their rescuers to that very spot. She would glance at the building's cornerstone each time, tracing the words with her fingers, "In service to others, we find our purpose." Those words had guided not only the spirits but the living as well. They were a reminder that kindness isn't passive. It's an active force that changes the world in quiet, lasting ways. Courage, love, connection. Those were the true legacies of that terrifying night. Because when 5 strangers decided to follow compassion into the dark, they discovered something extraordinary: that love and fear are not opposites, they're companions. The most profound kindness often comes from those who are afraid but act anyway. That night had begun with panic and ended in purpose. Years later, as the group gathered once more on a cool October evening, they stood together watching the sunset over the Mississippi River. The water reflected gold and crimson, the city alive with music. Grace squeezed Calvin's hand. "We were so scared," she said softly. Calvin smiled. Yeah. But we listened. She nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. And we loved. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had become her family, Grace understood the final lesson: the good we do outlives us. It travels like sound through air, like light through water, carrying hope to places we'll never see. And somewhere, perhaps, those spirits rested easier knowing their mission had not only been completed but continued, passed on through every act of courage, every kindness, every choice to love despite the fear. Love was never meant to stay still. It moves, through storms, through strangers, through time itself, leaving haunted hearts forever shining in its wake. The evening air was warm and sweet, carrying the sound of laughter and the distant rhythm of street music drifting through New Orleans. The renovated youth center stood proudly at the corner of Magazine Street, its bright mural glowing under the orange-pink sky. It had taken years of work, donations, and dedication. But tonight, it wasn't just a building. It was proof that compassion could outlive fear. Grace and Calvin stood near the entrance, their hands linked as the sun melted into gold behind them. They were married now, partners not just in love but in purpose. Calvin's hair was streaked with gray, but his smile was still as steady as the night they followed the spirits through the storm. Grace leaned against him, content, her heart full as she watched children run through the courtyard, safe, laughing, alive. Mrs. Patterson sat nearby in a wheelchair, her blanket draped neatly across her knees. Her eyes sparkled, still sharp with warmth and humor. Around her were the people she now called family. She waved at Timothy, who was leading a group of kids into the community hall, carrying art supplies under one arm and a soccer ball under the other. He had grown into a confident young man, gentle and steady. The boy who once hid under a torn blanket now dedicated his life to helping others. Every October 28th, he came early to decorate the center, always leaving a small white flower near the cornerstone, his quiet thank you to the spirits who once saved him. Lily and James stood beside their two young children, showing them the mural that covered one side of the building. It was painted with glowing outlines of figures walking through the rain, 5 people and the faint shapes of those who guided them. The children listened as Lily told the story in simple words, how their parents learned that kindness can turn even the darkest night into something beautiful. Music began to play. Calvin lifted his saxophone, joined by a few of his students. The melody that floated through the courtyard was the same one he'd written all those years ago, Haunted Hearts. But now it sounded different. Brighter. Hopeful. Every note seemed to carry gratitude. Grace looked around at all of them, at the people she'd once met by chance, on a night that could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it had started a lifetime of compassion. Her eyes glistened as she whispered softly, "We kept our promise." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "Yes, we did, dear. And look what it's become." The sky deepened into rose and gold, and for a moment, it felt as though the air itself shimmered. Grace thought she saw a flicker of light by the cornerstone, gentle, glowing figures just beyond the sunset. It didn't frighten her. It comforted her. The spirits were still there, watching, not haunting but protecting, their mission complete and their message eternal. Love. Service. Connection. Those values had changed everything. Grace stepped forward and spoke to the small crowd gathered in the courtyard. Neighbors, families, volunteers, children. We stand here tonight because years ago, we were scared but chose to care anyway. We learned that the most powerful force isn't supernatural, it's human kindness. It's what we choose to do when fear tries to hold us back. Love and kindness are actions, not words. Courage isn't found in being fearless, it's found in what we do despite the fear. Her voice wavered slightly but grew stronger. A small act of compassion can change a life. It can change many lives. We didn't plan to become a family that night, but we did, because we listened to our hearts. The crowd applauded softly. Lily held James's hand, their children clapping too. Calvin kissed Grace's forehead, his music carrying her words further into the evening air. As the last of the sunset faded, Timothy joined Grace on stage. "I used to think I was invisible," he said quietly, his tone sincere. "But that night showed me that people can be good, that even when you think no one's coming, someone always is. Maybe not in the way you expect, but help finds you when kindness moves people to act." He looked out at the audience, his smile faint but full of peace. "So if you ever feel afraid or alone, remember this: someone cared enough to follow the light through a storm. That same kindness lives in you." The courtyard fell silent. Only the sound of Calvin's saxophone lingered, a melody of love, courage, and gratitude. As the camera pulled back, the group stood together beneath the soft glow of lanterns. Grace and Calvin, side by side. Mrs. Patterson surrounded by laughter. Lily and James with their children. Timothy, guiding others toward hope. Behind them, the youth center shone like a promise, a reminder that compassion has no limit, no end. The screen slowly faded to black as Grace's voice echoed softly. "The greatest force isn't found in ghosts or miracles. It's found in kindness. In choosing love when it would be easier to walk away. Courage begins in those quiet moments when we decide to care. Even the smallest act of compassion can change everything." Thank you for watching. What act of kindness will you choose today? Share where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's story. Your support helps us create more powerful stories that remind the world that love still wins, and kindness is always worth the risk. Carry this message with you. Be brave. Be kind. Because even haunted hearts can heal the world.